In my article for our April Temple Chronicle, I talked about the particular challenges of observing Passover this year. The Seder, I noted, isn't intended only to evoke events of our people's mythic past, but even more to inspire action, to bring liberation today. Often, though, we have ignored our own Jewish people among those who are in need of liberation, who can be oppressed because we are Jews. The quintessential strangers of history, we can find ourselves as outsiders in the world in our own day. The last 6 months have provided a reminder that none of us wanted. The harshest reminder, of course, was in Israel on October 7th and has continued for more than 200 days now, with more than 130 Israelis still held hostage in Gaza. I went on to say that Jews in the United States had been accustomed in recent years to mounting antisemitism from the extreme right, and are now also facing antisemitism thinly cloaked in opposition to Israel. I heard from a former member who still reads our chronicle loyally. He asked me why I would only reference the extreme right when, in his estimation, the greatest threat to American Jews today is from the extreme left. Without comparing threats from extreme right and left, I thought I had acknowledged both. But I went back and reread what I had written, and he was right. I hadn't used the phrase the extreme left to describe a grave anti-Semitic threat to American Jews and to our people around the world. I rise tonight to correct that error. Let me be clear. A narrative that existed on the left long before October 7th began metastasizing on October 7th, before Israel had cleared Hamas terrorists from its internationally recognized borders or begun any retaliation in Gaza. The mindless left insists that any people who have less power, less wealth, and who, by their faulty estimation, are less white, are, by definition, oppressed. The argument goes on to insist that behavior that would normally be reprehensible, the brutal murder, sexual assault, and hostage-taking of October 7th, for example, must be understood as an act of desperation by oppressed people with no other option. By contrast, any group that is more powerful, wealthier, or perceived to be whiter is the oppressor. By this measure, uncorrupted by critical thinking or acknowledgement of complexities, Israel is the oppressor, and the Palestinian people are oppressed. Those who seek justice, therefore, must stand up for Palestinians and condemn Israel. The situation in Israel and in the Palestinian territories is complicated. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis and progressive Zionists everywhere support neither the Netanyahu government nor continued West Bank occupation. As I have described on this bema in the past, West Bank occupation is brutal and inhumane. I had hoped to speak tonight about the second-class status of Israelis, Palestinian, Druze, and Bedouin citizens, many of whom have valiantly supported the Jewish state since October 7th. I've rescheduled that subject to May 31st. As for the Palestinians, Abba Eban said it best decades ago. They never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Rejecting one peace proposal after the next, and turning repeatedly to corrupt leaders and terrorism, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza share responsibility for their pitiful, stateless condition. Arab nations, too, have made terrible decisions on behalf of the Palestinian people, deepening their suffering. None of that complexity is reflected in the anti-Israel encampments at Columbia and several other universities. Protesters at Columbia ripped an Israeli flag from the hands of Jonathan Lederer, a Jewish student, and set it on fire. "They were pushing and shoving me," said Lederer. "They threw rocks at my face. At that moment, my life was totally threatened." Protesters' free speech rights entitled them to call for their universities to divest of their ties with Israel, financial and otherwise, and probably even to chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The right to free speech, though, does not extend to assault, nor ought free speech protect incitement to violence, such as the protester holding a sign reading Al-Qassam's next targets with an arrow pointing at Jewish students. Al-Qassam is Hamas's military wing. Other demonstrators proudly proclaimed, "We are Hamas!" A banner at the University of Michigan reads, "Long live the Intifada," with chants of "globalize the Intifada." The student president of Michigan, Hillel, explained that she felt particularly threatened by that terminology, as Intifada calls for violence targeting Jewish civilians. Free speech does not permit what Nathaniel Crisp, Yale University's only Hasidic undergraduate, encountered. New York Times columnist Bret Stephens described the scene. On Saturday evening, Crisp and his friend Sahar Tartak paid a visit to the university's plaza, where pro-Palestinian demonstrators had set up an encampment. "I was wearing my black hat. I was very identifiably Jewish," Crisp said. "I was yelled at, harassed, pushed and shoved numerous times. Every time I tried to take a step, someone confronted me inches from my face, telling me not to move." Tartak said she was hit in the left eye by a Palestinian flag held by a protester. She ended up in the hospital, luckily without a permanent injury. "Thank God there was a small sphere at the end of the pole," she told Stephens. One American college campus where Jews feel unsafe, or worse, are unsafe, is one too many. Still, it's important to emphasize that while protests are widespread, the majority are confined to constitutionally protected speech, and most colleges and universities remain safe, if not always entirely comfortable, for Jewish students, faculty, and staff. As most of you know, both of my sons are university students. This week, the president of Brandeis University, Daniels College, reminded the world that it was founded in 1948 by the American Jewish community to counter antisemitism and quotas on Jewish enrollment in higher education, and that it remains committed to protecting the safety of all its students. In response to the current crisis, it extended the deadline for transfer applications, enabling students at schools with threatening demonstrations to seek the learning environment of the Brandeis campus. Robert is a graduate student at the University of Rochester. Early in the week, he told me about a tiny pro-Palestinian protest encampment there. The protest never really threatened Jewish students, but it was in the way of an annual campus celebration planned for today, until the administration convinced them to move it to a more benign location yesterday. Protesters unsurprisingly declared victory, and Newsweek bought it, hook, line, and sinker, without seeking comment from the university. The headline screamed, "Pro-Palestinian protesters claim win over one college's ties to Israel." Specifically, that Rochester would consider divesting itself of both financial and academic connections to the Jewish state. In response, the university issued a clear and emphatic statement that it had agreed to no such thing, proclaiming instead, university administrators made clear that neither demand that the university call for ceasefire and divest of ties with Israel was on the table. The statement continued, "There has not and will not be any commitments about future academic divestment of university programs in Israel." Later in the day, Newsweek updated its article to include the university's statement deep into the article, contemptibly leaving the inflammatory false claims and headline intact. Passover was, of course, observed in ancient Israel, but the Seder was developed later by our rabbinic sages, at a time when Jewish people lived in exile, oppressed and impoverished. Indeed, for most of Jewish history, we have sat down to the Seder in the face of persecution or at least discrimination. Most of us living today are not accustomed to that, but here we are, praying for the release of Israeli hostages at our Seder tables, and worried about homegrown anti-Semitism from both political extremes. Our sages prepared us for times like these and worse. They also taught us to open the door to Elijah, symbolizing our faith that we can bring the world ever closer to messianic redemption with God's partnership. Micah imagined a day, v'yashvu ish tachat gafno v'tachat einato, when all shall sit under their vine and fig tree with none to make them afraid. Lo yisag goy el goy cherev, v'lo yilmedu od milchama. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they study war anymore. Even Micah, though, could not have imagined we can offer that prayer in Hebrew, in English, and yes, in Arabic too. Perhaps the dream is messianic. Let these be the words, the chants, and the songs heard on college campuses across America. Amen.